Malcolm Gladwell, if one Googles the title of one of your most famous and most regarded books, Tipping Point, it's a moment of critical mass, the threshold, the boiling point. Do you think we are at a tipping point?
Depends what you're talking about. Tipping point about what? I mean, are we? You have to define. There could be many different tipping points happening all at once. I guess if we're talking about this coronavirus pandemic, I don't know whether we can draw any conclusions. It's been in the grand scheme of things, it's been a relatively brief interruption in our way of doing things. The kinds of crises in the past that have had catastrophic effects on society are ones of great duration. The Second World War was 5 years. The Depression was 10 years. The English had 100 years war once. So this has been 2 months. So I don't know. It's a difficult thing to kind of, in the middle of it, make a judgment about whether it's been transformative.
But what is different this time is that people have to practice a certain way of being with each other. They're having to lock themselves into their houses. There is very little freedom of movement. And this is something which nobody in this age has ever experienced.
Yeah, luckily we have, devices and technologies like the sort that we're talking to. Imagine this in the pre-internet age. It would have been a very different matter. To go back to the question of duration, the really fascinating thing from previous disruptions is how quickly people adapt. I had a chapter in my book, David and Goliath, about the London Blitz. And, what was fascinating with the London Blitz was the British government and military command knew that it was coming. And in their estimation of the Blitz, I mean, I'm sure I'm not telling anything that English listeners don't know already, but everyone assumed that it would cause widespread panic and that hundreds of thousands of people would flee London in distress. And none of that happened. And that's because people very quickly adapted to a very radical disruption in their way of being in their ordinary life. And that's I've always thought that is one of the most fascinating historical examples we have of how populations perform under stress. And, what's happening now as I look around is I don't think the threat of coronavirus is anything as grave as the threat of the bombing during the Second World War. But what we're seeing is a level of adaptation that's really quite remarkable.
I mean, the ingredients in this pandemic are partly about science and partly about humans. Are you happy with both?
Well, I am profoundly optimistic about the scientific part. I have every confidence that within the next few months, we will get dramatically better in treating this disease in the hospital setting. That I don't think we're going to see the kinds of mortality rates that we've seen so far, just because once this virus becomes less novel and something we're more familiar with, we'll get better at treating it in its most extreme form. But I'm a little less optimistic about the ability of governments the human part of this, to deal with the after effects of something like this. You have the great advantage of not living in the United States. If you lived here and you saw just the kind of buffoonery that takes place on a daily basis from the president of the United States, you would be, I'm sure, you would have a certain amount of despair about our capacity as a society to respond intelligently.
But isn't it perhaps the case, and hasn't it been demonstrated already, that in terms of leadership, actually leadership worldwide isn't in a terribly good state either?
If you think back, again, to use a World War II analogy, it has often been said about how extraordinarily lucky the world was in those years to have Roosevelt in the United States and Churchill in America. I mean, two first-class leaders that happen to be in charge of the two most important countries in that battle. We have not been as fortunate this time around. I would be happy with even a minor Roosevelt in the White House. We don't even have a minor Roosevelt. we have some, we have something we've not seen before. A man who, with a straight face, is giving press conferences where he's saying that we should be injecting bleach. I mean, there is no one who would have imagined that we would be at that moment in American politics. So, we haven't. One hopes in times of crisis that we catch a break when it comes to our leaders. We certainly in the United States have not caught that break this time.
Throughout our lives, at least, we have looked to American leadership in the West. America has been the undisputed leader. I mean, that is no longer true. And in a sense, surely it is this very virus that has consolidated that view.
The decision by the United States, by Trump, to halt funding for WHO was, to my mind, the most disturbing. Because, the virus, the great cliche is true, it knows no boundaries. The only way to intelligently thwart these kinds of threats is to act collectively. And we have an institution that coordinates our medical responses to things like pandemics, that is the WHO. To kind of strike out at the WHO precisely at the moment in history when its efforts and its role is most important is crazy. I mean, it makes as much sense as shutting down hospitals on the day that the pandemic broke, or laying off your firefighters when your city's on fire. I mean, that was the moment where I really began to tear my hair out.
But to that extent, surely you could speculate at least that at the end of this crisis, one thing is certain: America will cry out for a change, a constitutional change, even perhaps, to prevent one man doing something so, in your terms, dastardly.
Well, but it goes back to this question of adaptation. So there's a good side and there is a bad side to adaptation. The good side is that people's capacity to find normalcy in the face of threat and anxiety is quite extraordinary. That's what we saw during the Blitz, was people's ability to return to normal was something that no one had anticipated. The flip side of that, the more troubling side, is the people's willingness to return to a status quo, even after the status quo has failed them, is also quite extraordinary and unanticipated. My great suspicion is that America will emerge from this crisis and change nothing. It'll simply, with a great sigh of relief, go back to the way things were before. It is a striking fact about societies that they are unwilling to tinker with their basic institutions, even after those institutions have failed them.
Well, what about reducing it back to the human being? The human being is being asked all over the world to keep its distance, his or her distance, from another human being. Now, if that goes on for long, does that have no afterburn?
I think that one of the reasons we have been willing to go along with this strategy of social isolation is the understanding, rightly or wrongly, that has been given by our leadership that this is not going to last that long, that by the summer, things will change. This is going to disrupt my life for perhaps 2 months, but not beyond that. Now, if that expectation is not met, if that expectation of a relatively speedy return to semi-normalcy is not met, then I do think we're in for much more difficult times. I think that this kind of, there is in the back of most people's mind in the West, the idea that come May and June, the old way of doing things is going to at least partially return. And if that doesn't happen, I really do wonder what state we'll be in.
Well, give us, in conclusion, one thought of hope.
Well, I have enormous, as I said previously, my optimism is centered on the medical and scientific community. I don't think this virus is going to look as scary in August as it does now. I think it's already not as scary today in late April as it was in February. That part fills me with hope. But I tend to be much more of a pessimist when it comes to the human institutional response as opposed to the scientific community. I mean, this has always been the strange duality of the modern world, that we have an extraordinarily functional and innovative technological response that is married to an antiquated and clumsy political and social response. That's real life, right? That's the world we live in, and maybe this will get us. This experience will help us be a little smarter about how to make those two very different worlds speak more intelligently to each other.
Malcolm Gladwell, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Thanks.
Been a pleasure.